So, welcome everybody. I'll make the introduction brief. Before you is Scott McCracken, who is a professor of English at the University of Kiel. Scott McCracken is one of the important forces in modernism studies in the UK. He leads a Northern Modernism Studies seminar. He's written a couple of books on cultural studies, on modernism, masculinity, the city, Walter Benjamin, and now he's here. And he's going to talk about the scandal of defeat, the book project he's been talking to me about for as long as I've known him. And that's not that long, but it's
too long. Too long for the book, not too long for our friendship. It's probably true that we met just when I was first thinking about it, but it's been a book that's been a long time in the making. And it's really nice to be back here in Leuven. I had a very nice visit last time when I was talking about popular fiction, and I met Jan and some of the postgraduates. It was very helpful, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to try out some of these ideas on you, particularly some of the ideas about the German side of the project, because I think that's the area that I'm perhaps least qualified to write about, and so it's very good to have this opportunity, and feel free to be ruthlessly critical if that's what it needs. So the book project has a title, Thinking Through Defeat, Political Failure from the Paris Commune to the Fall of the Berlin Wall. So that's nice and neat and small and focused. The monograph is part of a meditation, if you like, on the comprehensive but not complete defeat of the left at the end of the 20th century, where people like Perry Anderson were saying in 2000 the only starting point for a realistic left today is a lucid registration of historical defeat. And the idea is that I go back to to various moments of defeat in the past, and then try and rethink the political situation of the present. Now, of course, when I started thinking about the book, which was kind of around 2005, so 10 years ago, the political situation was somewhat different to what it is now. There are maybe more, the sense of comprehensive defeat is perhaps not quite so total. But I think many of the things I say are still relevant, and as a historical study I hope it will still be useful. So the project comprises of sections, each takes its cue from a significant date: 1871, Paris Commune; 1933, the rise of Hitler; and 1989. I acknowledge that some people might find 1989 a kind of problematic date but that also can be explored. So part one explores the legacies of the Commune and the literary forms that emerged in its wake, and that's partly because the Paris Commune stood for much of the 20th century as a kind of paradigmatic example of failed revolution. But perceptions of its meaning changed radically in different decades, and I think there's some quite interesting revisitings of it after 1989. And I've used sort of as my starting points, I have more, there's Göran Verborn also talking about defeat, also Eric Hobsbawm at the end of his life, much of my life, probably most of my conscious life was devoted to a hope which has mainly been disappointed, and to a cause which has mainly failed. The communism is initiated by the October Revolution. But I think Hobsbawm, as with many historians, sees defeat as a potentially productive prompting to thought. And there's a kind of paradox which I've explored elsewhere between the mood of defeat, which can be paralysing, overwhelming, physically overwhelming, and this idea that many historians and philosophers have, that defeat can be mentally quite stimulating. Perhaps the most famous example of that is Koselleck, who writes that whereas for victors, he essentially says, it's a kind of inversion of the idea that all history is written by the victors. He says actually the defeated, if they live, write much better history than the victors, because for the vanquished, their first primary experience is that everything happened differently from how it was planned or hoped. If they reflect methodologically at all, they face a greater burden of proof to explain why something happened in this way and not in the anticipated way. If history is made in the short run by victors, historical gains in knowledge stem in the long run from the vanquished. So that's one starting point, and there is also a Paris Commune there. There's a big study which you may do in Wolfgang Schiffelbusch's, which has been a number of studies, on defeat. And I think for me the interesting thing about Schiffelbusch's study, which is immensely useful, and a chapter on the American South I think is fantastic, is the way in which, because he sees defeat primarily as national defeat and not as political defeat, he actually finds the commune a sort of obstacle or problem in his methodology. And similarly, the Spartacist uprising after the First World War, he sees these as moments of madness, because for him, defeat is a trauma from which a nation has to recover. So I have some issues with this idea of recovery, that defeat is something you have to recover from, come to terms with. So I wanted really to explore, start with the Paris Commune, because it presents a problem for Schiffelbusch. So he writes of the Commune, rather the Paris Commune melded the entire history of revolutionary and class struggle into a single great phantasm that drew on the memories of heroism and sacrifice of the Parisian people. And he uses in this last sentence the idea that the Commune is a kind of madness, a kind of lunacy that emerges as a result of defeat, because the communards had not recovered from national defeat. So I want to return to that idea. So my approach is not so much an alternative, but a kind of extension of Koselleck and Schiffelbusch's approaches. And I identified these four kind of aesthetic responses to the experience of political defeat. First one is almost kind of biblical, the idea of scatter. That God will scatter his enemies. But in fact, I think what you quite often find in the aftermath of defeat is an aesthetic of fragmentation that responds to the experience of dispersal and exile that often follows defeat. Second, reconfiguration, the attempt to overcome the debilitating experience of defeat. And I think neither Schiffelbusch or Koselleck really tackle the emotional affect of defeat and its physical effects. But one response is a kind of narrative reconfiguration into new conceptions of space and time. Thirdly, remembrance, the attempt to represent that which has been lost. And finally, what I call the speculative anterior, which is a kind of development of one of Zizek's borrowed ideas, which is the idea of the future anterior, which I'll come back to. But the idea of the speculative anterior is the idea to reopen the future that is closed down by defeat, by returning to a moment buried in the past when success still seemed possible. Or, to put it another way, where the possibilities that lay unfulfilled in the past are reignited in the present, so that revolution is, as Marx famously put it in his letter to Arnold Ruger, not just the creation of the new, but the completion of old work. So these foreign responses inform what I hope to be a reading of Brecht's response to fascism exile after 1933, and also my reconsideration of the period after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which will be part 3 of it. So Brecht will be part 2, and the the reconsideration of the period after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Big Three. And I'll be honest, I haven't done enough work on Brecht, despite reading and rereading the Svenborg Gedichte and wanting to look at The Days of the Commune. I don't feel I've got enough, so I'm going to apologise for really only looking at one Brecht poem, and a poem that you'll all know very, very well, and it's And die Nachgeborenen. There it is. And just briefly, very briefly, before moving on to talk about Bunte Gras, which will occupy the most of this paper, how we might approach Brecht's poems in terms of that fourfold approach. And first of all, I think in this poem, you see the idea of scatter in the kind of list of everyday practices, looks, the normality of everyday life is kind of collected together. The unfurrowed brow, for example, the careless laugh, eating and drinking. These are all kind of bits and pieces of the everyday, which he gathers together and then reconfigures in such a way, typically of Brecht, that they become strange, that they are defamiliarized, in such a way that we think about them not as everyday events, but moments that we should think about politically, because why should we be careless, why should we be unthinking, given what's going on in the world. There's also, he is encouraged in the poem to forget. Why not just forget? Why not eat and drink and not think about the present day? So there's a kind of, the process of the poem is the struggle against the ease with which you might forget about what is going on elsewhere. So there's the collecting together of the scatter of exile, there's its reconfiguration, there's the urge to remember. And finally, I was getting Anchor to help me with this idea last night. It's this final word, Nachsicht, which is usually translated into English as leniency or indulgence. Think about us with indulgence. But it seems to me that a sort of more literal translation as aftersight, which isn't really an English word. I mean, hindsight is a word, but hindsight isn't quite right. But Nachsicht seems to incorporate that dialectic between the present and the future, and then the future which is looking back at the present and in some way entering into a kind of dialogue with it. So I think in that word you have this idea of the speculative anterior, the way in which some projected future will come back and engage with the past. And perhaps, I mean, in this case, it's not so much opening up the possibilities of the past, but understanding the situation of defeat, and maybe then gaining some knowledge of it. So that was, apologies for that very brief idea of how I might approach Brecht, and on to the main subtopic of the talk, which is Bunte Gras's Ein weites Feld, and a very different kind of work of literature. I first came across the novel, there was a Frederick Jameson review of it before it was translated into English in London Review of Books, and I think that was possibly the only response to it I've read. And one of the things is there is very little written about it in Anglophone criticism. I don't know whether other languages have more in it, but it caused an absolute scandal in Germany in the mid-1990s. It was quite extraordinary. I mean, a scandal equivalent to the Satanic Verses, for example, in Britain. But obviously that was a global thing. Yet at the same time, it was also criticised for being boring and unreadable. And Marcel Reich, obviously there's a long history between Grass and Leakey, but this is a photo montage. He didn't actually rip it up. But there was a television programme in the Quartet in which it was ripped to pieces, metaphorically. And Oscar Necht put together this dossier, essentially, of all the different criticisms, reviews, commentaries on the novel, which just shows how much text it generated. So why, the first question is, why was this huge scandal about this book, which nobody seems to have read outside Germany? I think two aspects gave offence. First, the way the novel delves into Germany's past, exploring areas and periods the new nation would rather forget, and the context of the novel is very much the unification. Second, Grass writes it from the point of view of the losers, the defeated. He writes it from an East German perspective. And I think that alone was enough to ensure that both the author and the novel came under attack. Grass was, and it seems a ludicrous accusation, I think he was accused of stepping outside the role of the writer into the realm of the political. But Grass has always been political, so that seems absurd. And he's long used his position as a prominent novelist to make public interventions. And I think for a long time in the Federal Republic, these interventions were welcomed. The political stance of the Brecht lent cultural legitimacy to the rather thin anti-fascist credentials of the West German state at a time when its moral authority was weak and challenged by the overt anti-fascism of its communist other half. And then conveniently for the Bundesrepublik, Grass's anti-communist credentials were also good. He was a long-time member of the Social Democratic Party, although he's left it now, and he publicly supported dissident East German writers, and in 1966 he wrote a play which is kind of critical of even Brecht, den Aufstand, which is critical of Brecht's role in the East German workers' uprising of '53. But I think the interesting thing about Grass is that in his public utterances he's always refused to sit politically or culturally within the boundaries of the state with which he was a citizen, denying both the logic of the Cold War division and the lure of reunification. And his Danzig trilogy, the Brecht-Roman Katz und Maus and the Hundejahre, sought to secure in memory Germany's lost eastern territories without succumbing to the nostalgic nationalism of the German right. Instead, he adopted a position explicitly in essays of two states, one nation, which actually questioned Germany's moral right to a single state, yet argued for a common German culture. So given his political history, it would actually have been very naive to expect his first major novel after reunification to affirm the legitimacy of a state which he'd always not wanted to come into being. So instead of inventing a new national myth, Grass chose, as Necht puts it, to bring much that was buried and forgotten to light. In addition, as Necht sees it, Grass, to his credit, puts himself consciously on the side of the losers. That is, as Necht puts it, the side on which almost all the writers of great literature put themselves. Nonetheless, the novel's critics pronounce Grass as soft on the dead air, even accusing him of being a mouthpiece for the East German regime. And for Necht, this shows the decline in the public sphere of the new Germany. Yet at the same time, although it all received all this criticism, Ein Weitersfeld was read, or at least bought, we don't know whether people read it, in its thousands by Germans, even reached the bestseller list. So again, you have this paradox. And sales, I think, were partly fueled by the controversy, the sheer quantity of discussion it generated. It's also interesting, I think, that one of the main themes of the novel is itself collaboration. The theme of collaboration runs all the way through. Language is collaboration with power, the collaboration of artists with the state, and of literature with the perspective of the victor. If Grass begins from the position that that it's the artist's responsibility to side with the vanquished, he also seems acutely conscious that such a position will also always be compromised. Despite that, Grass seems to find some salvation in literary form, notably in the novel's ability to posit what Rancière calls un monde commun, a concept I think although Rancière doesn't cite her, is derived from Arendt's common world. So an optimistic reading of Mein Weites Feld might say that it shows the potential still existing in the novel as a form to expand and deepen not just the language of literature, but also the language of politics for a community. As Rancière puts it in a neat riposte to the classic Marxist formula, interpretations are themselves real changes when they transform the forms of visibility a common world may take, and with them the capacity that ordinary bodies may exercise in that world over a new landscape of the common. And I would argue that Mein Weites Feld strives for a literary language that might make visible such a democratic common world. And the way it does that is to reach back into the history of both the German and the European novel to demonstrate precisely the wide field from which a new post-war culture might draw. So it leans heavily on the rich resources of the German literary tradition, specifically on the work of the 19th century German novelist Theodor Fontana, so that the title itself, if you don't already know, is taken from a favourite phrase of the father in Fontana's Effi Briest, Es ist ein weites Feld. And the novel's quixotic hero, that is Grass's novel, not Fontana's, Fonti, is part of a kind of complex literary joke. So when you start reading the novel, the way that Fonti speaks makes you think that he is Fontana, because he seems to have such an incredible knowledge. It makes you think that he is Theodore Fontana, because he seems to have such an incredible knowledge of his life that he must have lived 200 years, that Fontana didn't actually die. Fonti just kind of carried on. And it's only gradually that you begin to realise that that's not the case, that he's just so much imbibed with Fontana's life that he speaks as if his memory. And then it turns out that, of course, he has the same number of children, he has a very similar life. You know, he even has a friend who is similar to Fontana's friends. But that debt notwithstanding, Grass's literary field extends beyond Germany to the history of the novel as a European and implicitly, I think, a world form. It deploys novelistic discourse in the Bakhtinian sense of an elusive, unstable and dialogic language as a counter to ideological and national limits. So the text is really impatient with borders, the borders between texts, between the cultural and the political, and even the border between literature and history. So it revels in its hero's Beauvoirism, his apparent inability to distinguish between fiction and reality. So he used all those resources in order to create this heterogeneous or to embrace this heterogeneous and impure past. Okay, so just as, another key intertext is Don Quixote, and just as Don Quixote is made up of serious adventures in which its protagonists travel across Spain, so Mein Weites Feld is composed of excursions that gradually lengthen, beginning with walks in Berlin and then extending by travelling beyond the city to the rest of the territory of the former DDR. It actually has two key protagonists who match on to Don Quixote, so Fonti is tall and thin, and his friend Hoftaler is a short, squat man, and is described as his day and night, Tag und Nacht Schatten. But whereas Sancho Panza's earthly realism acts to bring Don Quixote, the personification of novelistic excess, back to earth from his flights of fancy, Hoftaler's hold on Fonti is much more sinister. He uses a combination of jocularity and threats to prevent Fonti's escape from surveillance. But the two are kind of indivisible. You can't have one without the other. he says no literary trick could separate them. I'm conscious that I'm going very slowly through this. So let me talk a little bit about Fontana. I've talked about Fonti. Let me talk about Hoftaler. Now, if Fonti is taken from an actual character, Theodore Fontana, Hoftaler is actually lifted from an entirely different novel. So Hoftaler is taken from a novel by Hans Joachim Schädlich about a secret agent who is has actually lived, is kind of immortal. It's a dark Kafkaesque tale about an apparently immortal secret policeman, Talhofer, whose service to a series of repressive German states from Prussia onwards were invited to compare with the DDR. So it's a kind of anti-East German novel. So, born like Fontana in 1819 in Hans Joachim Schädlich's novel, Talhofer begins his career spying on Karl Marx and the radicals involved in publishing the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. Then after 1871, he continues his work as a secret agent for the newly unified German Empire. He then continues into the 20th century, starting surveillance of the Bolsheviks in Germany. He actually has a key role in getting Lenin in the sealed train across Europe to the Finland station. And then his professional life continues after the First World War. He moves with total ease into the Gestapo, and then after the Second World War, in fact, where one of his duties is to guard Stalin's son, who was a prisoner of war, he then slips seamlessly into the Stasi, continuing his defence of the German state, despite its political colours, until 1953, when his excessive zeal in putting down the workers' uprising causes him to be reassigned to the archives. In 1955, and this is in Schädlich's novel, he suffers a breakdown and retires to his house, where he reproaches himself for having failed to make himself be more effective, regretting in particular the aid given to Lenin. He retreats to his cellar and, in a kind of weird, mad monologue, he puts himself on trial and appears to condemn himself to death. And the assumption is that he does actually follow out that sentence and commit suicide. So, although the novel's ambivalent in its ending, the reader might reasonably assume that he carries out the sentence. But according to Grass, he didn't die at all. That was a mistake of his biographer. He carried on, he went to the West for a little while, and then he came back, and then engineered German reunification. So, in Schädlich's novel, Talhofer represents the logic of the totalitarian state, which eventually turns on itself, destroying its own existence. And in the aftermath of the Cold War and the demise of East Germany, his character can easily be read as a kind of representation of pure evil, the destruction of which can only be good, the happy ending of a morality tale. But that's to read Talhofer in one way only. If his loyal service to both the Nazis and the East German state is a judgment on the DDR, his surveillance of the communists in the Weimar Republic, his work under the Kaiser and earlier for Prussia, condemns those states as well. I think what Schädlich does is disrupt the idea of a safe before, as a Germany that exists pre-communism and pre-Nazism, to which a new Germany might return. And anybody visiting Berlin in the mid-90s could see that process as the kind of old Wilhelmite neighbourhoods like Prenzlauberg were kind of done up, and was a sort of attempt, and then the whole getting rid of the Volkspalast and the rebuilding of the Berliner Schloss is a kind of attempt to return nostalgically, and that of course ignores the extraordinary memory work that's been done in Berlin at the same time. But there was that tendency to say, well, let's go back. But Talhofer disrupts that idea that you can go back in an unflinching view of German history, which Grass then takes up and extends in the extended life of Hoftaler, the reincarnation of Talhofer. Whereas Schädlich's ending might be read as marking a clear line between the Federal Republic, the Bundesrepublik, and the repressive German state, Grass insists that reunification is not a reason to forget the past. shadily claustrophobic narrative never defines an alternative, which, in the context of the Cold War, could easily be assumed to be the West. Grass's Hoftaler lives on in a more jocular mode, and he is a very funny, comic character. This is one of the reasons I think why the novel was considered offensive, because what everybody wanted was a film like The Lives of Others, where the secret policeman is a pure evil, melodramatically so, and not this funny secret policeman who makes difficult jokes. He's worked for both sides during the Cold War, and he even hints that the new German state is now finding his expertise useful. At the end of Fontana's text, the wide field gestured to, at the end of Effi Briest, the idea of ein weites Feld really refers to the wild field beyond bourgeois morality. In ein weites Feld, though, I think the wide field is the ideological field beyond the binaries of the Cold War and the post-Cold War, this hardening rhetoric of victory in defeat. And it's in the dialogic relationship between Fonti and Hoftaler in Grass's novels that these categories are undone, because there is no simple division between good and evil between Hoftaler and Fonti and Fontana. It turns out that Fonti, for example, as well as being a free spirit and apparently the inheritor of the German liberal tradition, is also an informer. He's a Mitarbeiter for the Stasi. He's both surveyed and surveillant. And this problematic sort of ambivalent character of Fonti is nowhere more apparent than what's become the most controversial statement of the novel. Where Fonti comments about the DDR, we lived in a comfy, commoden dictatorship. And that's been picked out by many critics as an evidence that Grass was just far too soft on East Germany in the novel. So in an interview published in 1996, Grass responds to that accusation actually with two answers, one of which is political and one as literary. First of all, he defended the statement as a historically accurate description of East Germany. He says, if I compare the situation in the DDR with the way things were in the Soviet Union for a long time, or as they were in Romania until the end, or in Chile, or in Greece under the colonels, then the DDR was a relatively comfy dictatorship. It was still a dictatorship, but that's not enough for the mentality that has expressed itself in some of these criticisms and likes to exaggerate the victory it thinks it has won. Thus, the defeated adversary, an adversary who no longer really exists, is made more dangerous in retrospect to increase the sense of victory. This is basically a very odd, foolish process. But then, in the same interview, he also points out that the statement is delivered by Fonti, a character in the novel, not by him, the novelist, and that actually Fonti is himself quoting a letter written by Fontana to his wife, describing his unhappiness not after 1989, but after 1871. There, Fontana laments eloquently and angrily about the depravity of the Prussian nobility, about the parvenu children of the bourgeoisie, about the eternal reserve lieutenants, etc., everything that irritated him about his time, and then in a typical Fontanian way, he qualifies it all and says, and despite this, we have to say we live in a comfy dictatorship. So Fonti's statement is not only that of a character in a novel, but it's an intertextual comment. So what are we to make of Grass's two apparently contradictory responses? In the context of the novel, we can see that the first response is framed within the political discourse proper to Hoftaler. It's realist, could even be described as cynical. The second is a defense of literary discourse itself, the nuances of which are lost when a single statement is substitute for the heteroglot, multi-voiced, multi-style, and often multi-languaged, to quote Brecht, elements of the novel. Fonti's words, as a repetition of Fontana's, invite us to read reunification critically against the history of the first unification and its consequences, so the myth of a return to a national destiny is interrupted and disturbed. If those same words change their meaning when applied to the DDR, their slipperiness opens up a more general questioning of state power. Through the statement's novelisation, both the experience of the DDR and the new state are relativized in terms of a long history. Yet, Grass's first political defence is an acknowledgement that a purely literary defence is not enough. Literature can never entirely free itself from the demands of politics, which always bring it to past. Hofstadter, as a representative of the ideological novel, will always limit Fonti's aspirations to the merely literary. So, like Quixote and Sancho Panza, Fonti and Hofstadter need one another. But where Cervantes' characters represent the opposition of literary imagination and material reality, in this, their latest incarnation, they represent the relationship between an expansive and dialogic German-European literary culture and the state. Whereas a certain liberal view of culture would see these two aspects in opposition, I think both Bakhtin and Grass would suggest that they're not so easily separated. The centrifugal tendencies of heteroglossia, the capacity for meanings to extend and multiply, which Bakhtin sees as the essence of the novel form, are in dialectical relationship with the centripetal organising principle of narrative, which is necessary for it to make sense. If Fonti stands for the possibility of heteroglossia, Hofstadter gives it shape, although they sometimes reverse their positions. So sometimes it's Hofstadter who provokes multiple meaning and Fonti who acts as policeman. It's not an entirely stable relationship. But Hofstadter is mostly the political limit to Fonti's heteroglossia, that which stops his endless productivity becoming meaningless, and Fonti gives Hofstadter's modest narrative a heteroglot grammar that opens up the future. So it's not surprising then that collaboration is a key term because of this literary collaboration. Fonti is both representative of soft literary resistance to the East German state, but as I've said, he's also an occasional, almost shockingly casual, unofficial collaborator, Mitarbeiter, one who works with the East German security services. The novel is narrated by a series of a kind of collective chorus of archivists, those who work in the Fontana archive, and they surmise that his reports to Hofstadter about the East German literary scene in Prenzlauberg were betrayals that were also designed to protect. His reports, well informed to be sure and characteristically sardonic, and his witty thumbnail sketches of the individuals in question, cut down to medium-sized these young geniuses who aroused the state's suspicions. Not surprisingly then, one of the key concerns of the novel is the boundary not just between meaning and non-meaning, but between reality and fiction. The novelistic problem of Bovaryism, which Rancière has recently returned to, not that recently actually, maybe recently when I first wrote this, returned to in his essay on Flaubert's novel, in the Politics of Literature, when he writes about Madame Bovary. Now, for Rancière, Emma Bovary's crime is not moral but aesthetic, not adultery per se, but a refusal to distinguish between two different sorts of enjoyment. He begins his essay with the question, why was it necessary to kill Emma Bovary? And his answer is that she doesn't mistake literature for life, she positively demands a life and a literature that can merge into a single reality. What defines her character is her refusal to distinguish between the material enjoyment of material goods and pleasure and the spiritual enjoyment of literature, art, and lofty ideals. So Emma's mistake, her sin against art, is to assume the artist's privilege of seeing the possibility of the aestheticization of everyday life. However, for Rancière, that's not just a question of aesthetics, but one of politics. The question of who's allowed to decide whether we aestheticize daily life or not is a democratic one. And Flaubert, the advocate of pure literature, kills Emma because she makes visible a more democratic aesthetic, one which is available to a common world. And I think it's instructive to compare Emma's mistake with the scandal that Invictus felt provoked. His crime, like Emma's crime, was characterised